Little Big Planet 1, one of the best games I remember from my childhood. It was filled with such joy and creativity and inspired the player to really dive into its mechanics and use their imagination to create whatever they could come up with. There's a reason why it was Sony's front poster child game for so many years throughout the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3's life cycle. Sackboy and the rest of the team that eventually followed him in the sequels were so lovable, and I think that's part of the reason why this game was so popular at the time when it released. In all my years, I can't remember playing another game like Little Big Planet where the developers literally gave you the tools they used to make their game and said go ahead. I think the creative mode was one of the most impressive features Little Big Planet introduced and was definitely further developed in the future sequels and gave it such replayability, and that's not even discussing community levels. But with that ramble out the way, in today's video I want to get into what made the Little Big Planet series so popular and why Sony believed in it so much, using it as their headline figure for the company. And I also want to look at the downfall of the Little Big Planet series and why we haven't gotten a fourth game yet. Yes, we had Sackboy's Adventure, but we haven't had a direct sequel to Little Big Planet 3, and we all know how that game was received on launch, and I'll spoil it now, it was a lot more negative than the first two, and that partly comes from internal struggles within the company and developers having a different studio work on the third game as opposed to the first two. But we're going to be getting into all of that in the video, so if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, drop a like on today's video, hit that subscribe button, and without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so Little Big Planet 1 released in 2008, and this was at the height of the console wars between PlayStation and Microsoft, and PlayStation sort of found themselves in a tricky position when trying to compete with Microsoft's games and brand identity. You'll remember Microsoft had many recognizable franchises such as the Halo franchise, and this is something PlayStation was sort of lacking in. They had tried with other franchises such as Killzone, and they had things like Uncharted, but nothing that really rivaled stuff like Halo from Microsoft. And then that's where Little Big Planet came in. They were looking for a family-friendly mascot that they could use to represent the Sony brand and PlayStation, something that all players of all ages could love. Little Big Planet was one of the best games Sony could have picked to be its figurehead, as it does away with one of the main criticisms games usually face, and that is taking away kids' creativity. And that is just the complete opposite of what Little Big Planet is. It's all about creativity, using it to create whatever you want. And that's why, as a kid, I originally fell in love with this game. It let our imaginations run wild, creating whatever we could think of or dream of. And I feel like this was seen by the company Media Molecule, as they later went on to produce a game called Dreams, which is sort of like Little Big Planet on steroids, where they sort of really more so focused on the creative and game design element rather than a story and characters. I did play Dreams and I found that the story was actually quite engaging, but the mechanics was very advanced. Like, it took me a very long time to learn how to make levels and stuff. It's a lot more complicated than what we have in Little Big Planet and seems like a natural evolution of where this game was coming from. Okay, so now I want to break down Little Big Planet 1's story and why I think it's so good for a platformer like this. The story is super light-hearted and fun and takes us on a journey to save creativity from the evil collector. Okay, so the way Little Big Planet 1's story works is you work your way through a series of 8 different worlds, all with their own theme, culminating in a sort of penultimate boss battle at the end of each world. Every world we're introduced to has its own characters in them as well that we get to know throughout the game. So in Little Big Planet 1 we have the gardens, which which is where we start, and this is like a whimsical floral themed area, likely inspired by places like the United Kingdom. And then following this we have the Savannah, which is more of a sun-drenched Savannah themed world, most likely inspired by places in Africa. Our third one is the Wedding, and this is a festive party themed world, possibly inspired by South America. Then we have the Canyons, a rugged canyon themed area inspired by places like Mexico and deserts. Then the fifth one we have is the Metropolis, and this is a bustling city themed world inspired by places like New York from the United States. Our sixth world is the Islands, and this is like a tropical setting. Then we have the Temples, which is a mysterious temple themed world, possibly inspired by places like India. And then finally, to top it off, we have the Wilderness, which is a snowy themed area inspired by places like Antarctica, Siberia, and this is where we'll also have our penultimate battle with the Collector at the end of the game. So I want to break down all of these different worlds and rank them on which I think is the best and which I think is the worst. Okay, so let's start where Sackboy's adventure begins, in the gardens. Something you'll notice right off the bat is that none of the characters in this game have voice actors. It's all purely text-based interactions with a few sort of strange noises each character makes along the way. However, this by no means takes away from some of the emotional story beats that this game hits throughout its story. Even when talking to characters such as this Humpty Dumpty character who sat on this wall, you still feel like you're talking to someone else in this world, and that goes for any of the other characters we're going to encounter throughout our journey. And the same can be said for the Collector, the main antagonist of this game. Even though he spends the whole game not saying one word, it doesn't stop him from being intimidating and a big threat to Sackboy. Okay, but getting back to the gardens, this is mainly used as a sort of tutorial world. In the first level we're introduced to the characters, and then in the second level, Get a Grip, we're introduced to some of the mechanics LBP has to offer, such as the grab mechanics when we're rolling on the cupcake platforms and moving garden furniture about to traverse the level. This is later expanded on the third level, Skate to Victory, where it shows how some of the physics mechanics in Little Big Planet work and how you can really use your environment and the things you have available to you to make epic levels. Overall, the Gardens has some great levels and introduces us to the world of Little Big Planet and all of the mechanics of the game, but I can't help but feel that there is just so much better levels on the way. So for now, I'll give this a mid-tier rating. And just for context, I'll be rating every single stage of the game an either low tier, mid tier or top tier rating, and then at the end I will give my opinions on the best levels of Little Big Planet and the worst and why I think that. But continuing, let's move on to the Savannah levels. Now, I actually love the art style for these levels. I love all these drafts and monkeys that you can climb and swing off, and how Media Molecule have used the theme and environment to make an engaging platformer. So let's look at some of the levels. In the first level of the Savannah, it's called Swinging Safari, and this introduces the player to the swinging mechanics as I previously mentioned, and teaches basic physics-based puzzles. Then we have the Burning Forest, a favourite of mine, and this is a little bit more fast-paced platforming with a lot of fire hazard in it, and that's something you'll notice as we go through all of these worlds. Every single one will teach you a new mechanic of the game, so the player's always learning as we go through the story. And another level of note worth mentioning is the final one, Zola's level, which is the final Savannah stage and is the first boss-like creature we'll encounter on this story. And this is the Buffalo Stampede, which emphasizes escape mechanics and environmental interactions, and it all ends with Zola thanking Sackboy for his services in helping in the Savannah. Overall, I love this level in LBP and I think it deserves a top tier rating. It's got a great aesthetic, great soundtrack, and a lot of challenging platforming. Okay, so now on to one of the stages I have more of a love-hate relationship with, and that is the Metropolis. So let's start off with some of the positive. The Metropolis has one of the best intro missions for a level in the main campaign, and that is the Lowrider mission. This one introduces us to urban elements, funky vehicles, and focuses on jumps, timing, and more of the platforming elements we're used to now. But I think one of my favourite parts of this first mission is when you're challenged by a local gangster in the city to a race, and this sees Sackboy speeding off down the main strip of the Metropolis, ending in a big crash. And this is also the developers showing what else the game can do. You can create vehicles, really selling that point of you can create whatever you can imagine in this game. However, that's about where all of the positive things I have to say about this level end, because I find a lot of the later missions, such as the suburbs and the construction site, a little bit tedious and boring when you're just jumping across different platforms in a construction site or going down the subway and just riding on a train. It's not as fun as some of the other missions that are available to us here, and I feel like could have done something different here. They had a whole city available to them, and with this theme I feel like they could have just done something so much more exciting. And for that reason, the Metropolis gets a mid-tier rating. Okay, so moving on to the wedding, and this world has a lot more of a darker and gothic tone to it, and this is really where the platforming element of LBP starts to get a little bit more difficult. Players are getting used to the mechanics now, they've been taught a lot of the core mechanics of the game, and now this is where it starts to get a little bit more difficult and they start to challenge the player a bit more. Now, I love the wedding. There's a lot of interesting missions and it's got a really cool theme and story behind the world. You're sort of at this gothic wedding and trying to help the groom get to the bride so they can get married, but obviously it's not that easy. There's a lot of challenges we're going to encounter and a lot of platforming we're going to have to get through in order to get to the wedding, and I love this stage. I feel like it's got a lot of great missions, a good story, great theme and soundtrack, and honestly one of my favourite, especially with the penultimate mission when you're running from the bride who's on this massive bike skeleton thing. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's chasing you and you've got this fast-paced platforming that you've got to get across to reach the end before she kills you. And it's one of the harder missions in the game where you've got to be really precise with your jumping and really quick because she's coming fast right behind you. So it's really high octane and I do love it, and for that reason I think the wedding deserves a top tier rating. Okay, so now let's move on to the Canyons set of levels, and this one I have a few things to say about, because on the surface it looks and seems really cool. You know, it introduces us to the explosive mechanics LBP has. It uses TNT crates and detonators for you to progress through the levels, and there's a lot of new sort of enemy types we're introduced to as well. As well as this level you can see on the screen right now, Serpent Shrine, which is a more puzzle heavy focused level, which blends platforming and time-based jumping to avoid these snakes and obstacles as you go throughout the level. However, despite it introducing us to some of these cool new mechanics that the game has to offer, I find it to be quite boring, especially in its design choice. The Canyons tends to reuse a lot of design elements, especially this sort of rusty material that we see in the background, which is reused all throughout this section. Compared to some of the other worlds we have, the developers were just a little bit lazier with this one, especially when it comes to the aesthetic. Gameplay wise, it's not that bad. You know, there's some great content here, some challenging platforming, but when it comes to the design, I just don't find it very interesting, especially when comparing it to others that are just vibrant and full of life, such as the gardens and the wedding, which feel really inspired in their design. It feels like they had a lot of passion and thought put into them, which is just not what I feel from the Canyons. It also relies a little less on skill and more on timing and luck, knowing how long some of the obstacles are going to take to come round, especially in the snake level. And the boss battle for the end of this set of stages is really boring. It's basically just dragging some explosives to a cardboard wall until you've blown through it enough to destroy him. So nothing special and nothing really exciting. So for all of those reasons, I'm gonna give this a low tier rating. And don't get me mistaken, this doesn't mean that they're bad, but just in the grand scheme of LBP1 levels, it's just not up to the same quality as some of the others. I still love the canyons, but just compared to some of the other levels we have in the game, it just falls on the lower end. The temples is one of the more interesting worlds with a distinctly Indian inspired ornate theme. It has a lot of great architecture and an amazing aesthetic, as well as some great gameplay and levels to go through. I love these blue sort of avatar looking Indian inspired people you platform across and that are dancing in the background. The whole level is very true to and respectful of Indian culture, whilst also being fun and challenging for the player. Okay, but let's get into some of the levels in the temples. So starting off with the first mission we're on, the Burning Temple, and this is where the game starts to get a bit meaner, but in a good way. It's the trial by fire level that separates casual players from those who've mastered Sackboy's slightly floaty physics. It's one of the most intense stages in the game and a real wake-up call for after the more puzzle-centric Metropolis that was prior to this. The next of these levels I want to discuss is Serpent Shrine, and this is easily one of the most visually inventive levels in the game. The combination of environmental storytelling and movement gives it an elegance. Whilst the Burning Temple tests reflexes, the Serpent Shrine tests rhythm and timing and is more satisfying because of it. Overall, the Temples is amazing, mixing challenging platforming gameplay with a great aesthetic, and for this reason I'm going to give it a top tier rating. Okay, so now moving on to the islands, and in concept this is sort of like a Japanese inspired Asian temple levels, and in theory this sounds really cool, but in execution it's maybe not as great as it could have been. So let's discuss some of the levels in the temples. So on level number 2, Sensei's Lost Castle, it has a dark, mysterious and slightly eerie theme, and it has a great atmosphere because of this. The lighting and fog effect create a sense of danger and forgotten history, and it introduces more reactive hazards like surprise crushing blocks and time jumps to keep you on edge. However, I feel like it's too reliant on the sudden death traps, and many sections feel like a trial and error rather than skill based, and certain parts visually are just too dark and cluttered, which leads to cheap deaths when you can't see what's coming. This doesn't evolve much, the whole level stays in one visual tone, which just leaves it to sink into the back of your brain and not be remembered. So for that reason I'm going to give the islands a mid-tier rating. Okay, so now on to our last but not least level in Little Big Planet 1's story, and that is the Wilderness. So this is where the game fully embraces the dark side and pulls no punches. It's cold, mechanical and chaotic in the Wilderness, and it's a direct thematic contrast to the warmth of the gardens that Sackboy started in. It tries to deliver an emotional stakes with all of the main characters we've met across the game captured by the Collector, and we are tasked with saving them all. So let's discuss a few of the levels in the Wilderness. So the Collector's Lair is honestly one of my favourite in the game. It's a quick tone switch up from the first level, the Tundra, being out in the snow, to now being inside the lair of the Collector. It's got a real grungy Tim Burton aesthetic, and the colour palette is really muted grey and browns and dark colours, which really contrasts the sort of vibe of creativity that we've been through in places such as the Savannah, the Gardens and the Metropolis. Media Molecule are really trying to get across the message that this is where creativity comes to die. Now, from a gameplay standpoint, there's a lot of tension in the lead up to the final battle you have with the Collector. However, I feel like it's not as executed as well as it could have been. It doesn't feel like a big final boss battle. I feel like once you understand the rhythm and pattern that the big mech goes in, it's really not much of a challenge to defeat him, which is sort of underwhelming. But when we do, we have this amazing message at the end where we find out that the Collector just had no friends, and that's why he did the all, and then everyone reunites in a big happy ending, and it's kind of a nice message to have at the end of the game, especially for kids who are playing this. Even though I do wish they gave him a bit more of a complex, in-depth motivation, but still I think this is a great satisfying ending for the game, and for that reason the Wilderness gets a top tier rating, ending off all of the different levels we have in the Little Big Planet 1 campaign.
Okay, it's time to shake things up a bit. If you tilt the wireless controller you're holding, you can animate yourself. Press the left stick to alternate between moving your head and your pelvis.
Story out the way, let's briefly get into the creative mode, the other half of the gameplay loop in Little Big Planet, and the mode I arguably got way more enjoyment out of as a kid growing up. And the best part about Little Big Planet's creative mode was not only could you create whatever you want, but you could also publish it, which created thousands of user-generated levels, which I remember sinking hours into. I remember being in awe because I was never really amazing at the game, so seeing some of the levels other users around the world had created just left me speechless with how great some people are with mastering the mechanics of the game. And so many of these levels you could tell had pure passion and heart put into them. Some maybe took weeks to complete, months even, creating whole stories and importing IPs like Star Wars and Marvel into the Little Big Planet universe, and people telling their own story. And this was all because LBP1's tools are shockingly deep. Logic switches, piston mechanics, emitter sensors were all way beyond what you'd expect from a game like this, especially one that was advertised as just sort of a fun platformer. It isn't all perfect though. The UI in today's standards can be a little bit clunky and menu heavy. There's a redo and undo option, but it's a little bit clunky and really not the best way they could have done this in my opinion. And precision is a bit of a challenge. Aligning things or editing logic chains can sometimes be trial and error and a little bit difficult. All that being said, it was a marvel at its time and laid the foundations for Little Big Planet 2 and 3 to build off of. If the creative mode wasn't so good in Little Big Planet, I don't think it would have survived for how long it did. The community levels were the beating heart after the credits rolled, and this is where the real game lived after you had completed the campaign. And I feel like the dynamic they had where you could unlock elements that can be used in the creative mode from the campaign really encouraged you to play the campaign as well and not just go into the creative mode and the community and the online. It sort of gave players a reason to engage with the campaign if they wanted to create the best levels they could. And this is part of the reason why Little Big Planet 3 gets as much hate as it does, because I feel like Sumo Digital weren't ready to take on what Media Molecule had built up over 2 games. What they had was really unique, and passing it over to a different studio to develop the 3rd game without any prior experience inevitably led to it being a really buggy mess. Okay, so at the start of this video I had planned to do a retrospective on the whole of the Little Big Planet franchise, but I'm sort of realizing as going on with it is I'm not going to have as much time as I usually have for videos in the coming weeks as I'm moving, so I've decided I think it'll be a better idea to break it down into 3 separate videos, and if they do well and you're enjoying them, I'll even include the spin-offs like Little Big Planet Karting as well. This is by far the longest video I've done on my channel so far, and I think that helps because I am a genuine fan of Little Big Planet and loved the games. So if you'd like to see me review the other 2 games, then drop a like on this video and hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel and helps me keep doing these videos weekly for you guys. But with that all being said, I'm going to leave you with a bit of Little Big Planet footage to end off this video. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. Again, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and for the next month I won't be posting as regularly, but I will definitely be back to posting at the end of July. And with all that being said, thank you, goodbye.